Shabbat Shalom. As I'm sure you were able to gather by my introduction to the Haftarah, or for those of you that are regular, my constant prattle, I am a little bit of a language geek. I love the whole concepts of language, the whole way that it shapes and guides our relationships and our connection to the world around us. I can't get enough of it, which is why it was always disappointing that I was a miserable failure in language classes, as much as I enjoyed linguistics itself. My Spanish teachers tried their best, and I'm lucky that I can remember that I grew up in La Mesa, and that it was next door to El Cajon. And I sort of remember what those words mean. La Mesa means, and El Cajon means the coffin or the box, the closet. It can mean lots of different things depending upon context. For us in San Diego, it meant the place that was really, really way too hot during summer. That was what I remember very much, because it was a valley, hence the term El Cajon. It was boxed in by the mountains around, and the heat would sit there. But I noticed something when you were helping me with my translations. La Mesa is the table, and El Cajon is the box, valley, whatever you want to call it. You translated the words la and el as the. How can two different words be the same word in English? It's easy. Well, because English is mean and beats up other languages and steals what it likes. That's true. But why are both la and el the in Spanish? What's the difference between them? Gender. Oh, I see. So la walks around in a dress and high heels and lipstick, and el walks around, well, in whatever your stereotype of a man's attire would be. What, cowboy boots maybe? No, the steel-toed work boots as opposed to high heels. Well, we can talk about that more later. Why would a table be a girl, and why would the cajon be a boy? They're relative to the gender generated. So someone really looked at a table and said, I like the legs on that. That is going in the girl pile. Where now that we're not eating off the dirt in the cave, and we're, well, I mean, obviously Spanish was derived from Latin, which was far from the caveman society, but now that we're no longer eating off of things that are just, a platter on the floor, now this has become a girl, yeah. And cajon, I look at that, and I can't help think that one day it's going to want to throw a football. So let's make that a boy word. Is this the evolution of gendered language? No. Linguists are still debating exactly why so many cultures around the world decided to start labeling things in genders, but they are very much convinced that they don't actually apply the concept of gender to the object that is gaining a gendered inflection in that language. So that no one who is speaking Spanish is thinking especially effeminate thoughts when thinking about tables, nor masculine thoughts when thinking about however you want to translate cajon in different contexts. That these are just words. And like most of us, we just blunder through our native language, and especially, without thinking about the rules that it has thrown in front of us of why we have all of the various grammar that we do. We just do it because it is the way we talk. And if we don't do it, then people tell us we're wrong. So we learn at a very early age to just obey those rules. But we don't always have the luxury of simply obeying the rules. In particular, in Judaism, we have an interesting conundrum when we need to take Hebrew, which is the language of our people for 3,000 years, plus, really, when we go back through the archaeological record, but 3,000 years of actual Judaism, and we want to make it accessible to a modern person. When we want to make it accessible to someone who was not raised speaking Hebrew, who was not initiated into Hebrew as the native language, which is, by and large, the majority, I dare say the vast majority of non-Israeli Jews, we take a gendered language like Hebrew, which is every bit as gendered as Spanish, French, or those other types of languages, and then render it into our wonderful Anglo-Saxon, French, Greek, Latin mix that we call English. And in English, we don't gender anything except things that have gender. Right? We have this wonderful word it, and that's what we use for boxes and tables and other things. And when something has a gender, then we'll slap on he, she, and do all of the magic that the English does when we finally are talking about gendered words. Now, that's not too bad if we're talking about Moses. It's not too bad if we're talking about Miriam. Abraham's easy, Sarah's easy. We can put them in the right box. We're doing fine. Adonai. What do we do when we hit God? How do we render God as from Hebrew into English? Okay, we can say Adonai, that's fine, no problem. Adonai is just a lovely word, and we can even avoid all the verb conjugations because it doesn't really matter in English. But you know, that book that we were just reading, it uses a lot of pronouns to stand in for God, because we know from Schoolhouse Rock that saying all those nouns over and over really wears you down. So it does use a pronoun to refer to God, primarily the pronoun who. And yes, the pronoun in Hebrew is who, and who in Hebrew means, but does it mean that when we talk about God? No, but that's what the word translates as. So God, therefore, is gendered masculine, yes? What's that? Most of the time. What's most of the time? Feminine pronouns, less common, but feminine metaphors abound when dealing with God. So what do we do? Now, in Hebrew, it's perfectly fine, because if you are a native Hebrew speaker and you are properly versed in understanding what God is, then when you see the who referring to God, it doesn't create any more of a masculine image than if you were using who to refer to any other inanimate object that would also have that same pronoun in Hebrew. But when you bring it into English, boy, do people get confused. So let's clarify a few things. That there is gendered language in the sense of the inflections and the conjugations and all of that great stuff that goes into the grammar that I love so much and do so poorly when it comes to a foreign language. There is definitely gendered language in that, and that is a technical term of how do you conjugate? What suffix do you use? Which adjective forms do you bring to it? Right? Am I going to say el? Am I going to say la? All of those wonderful elements are nothing to do with biological gender and everything to do with linguistic grammatical constructs that just help us communicate in ways that are handed down for thousands, in some cases even longer, of years. But actual gender, that is to say biological gender, human gender, or animal gender, what's that based on? Because that's not based on all of the wonderful issues. Right, it's based on, well, what body parts you have. It's based on what hormones are in your body in different proportions. It's a lot more confusing than people think, because as anybody who's ever studied Mishnah with me will know, that the Mishnah does not shy away from the border cases of having the tum-tum and the androgynous and all sorts of other categories of how people can come into this world. But it has to do with the mechanics of the human body by and large when we talk about gender in that particular way. Now, there are more modern sociological discussions of gender that actually reflect that humanity doesn't neatly actually apply those concepts, and we'll come back to them. But for the moment, let's deal with that first and biological level of gender. Does God fit into a biological category of gender? Why not? Excellent, right? Eino guf. God has no body, which is particularly ironic because eino is using the masculine suffix for possessive, him. He has no body, which tells you that we get into a real problem in English, because how can you be a he without a body with which to ascribe a gender to? Well, because English doesn't like using it when referring to God, because in English, referring to something as an it is absolutely an inherent insult. You are demoting the status of anything once you refer to it as an it. So we would never dare in English, following English rules, to refer to God as an it, even though that would probably be the more logical form to use in English when referring to the Holy One, but it feels wrong in English, and we're stuck with feelings as well as with language. So if God has no body, God can have no gender. Well, then maybe we should look and say, maybe we're talking about gender as a construct at this point. We're not talking about the biology of God, because God has no biology, God has no pulse, God has no reproductive organs, God has no hormones. God is non-physical. That's kind of, point number one in Jewish concepts of God. But maybe God identifies one way or the other, bodily or not, biology or not. Maybe God is more masculine than feminine, more feminine than masculine. How would we decide that? We can't just ask God, because God doesn't answer those questions so easily these days.
Look in the Bible and see what it says in there.
Look in the Bible. Let's dig it up. Now, the problem is, in order to answer that question, we would need to know what we would identify as being signifiers of God's masculinity or femininity. Do we see the problem there? That would mean I would have to know what God intended to be a signifier of masculinity or a signifier of femininity. So when we read in the prophets of God striding through the enemies and his clothes are drenched as with the stomping of grapes, meaning he's covered in blood, is that a masculine image or is that a feminine image? Is it the image of the warrior, which can only be masculine? Can it only be masculine? Is it the image of the feminine working in the agricultural field, stomping grapes? Anybody who has ever seen I Love Lucy knows that image very well. And that was a feminine activity in some communities. And it was a masculine community, a masculine activity in other communities. When we see God bouncing Ephraim on his knee, stand-in of Israel, as dandling a child, as it's often rendered into the archaic English, is that a masculine image? Or is that a feminine image? Or would we be projecting our own stereotypes of masculinity and femininity from the 21st century into a book that was written 3,000 years ago to attempt to reach an audience which, to be honest, was not as hung up about whether this particular toy should belong in the boy aisle or the girl aisle. They were not worried about what would be feminine or masculine. They were worried about, what does God do? And look at what God does. God fights wars on our behalf. You want to put that in the masculine part of the scale? But then again, what is the very first act of kindness that God does in the entire Torah? We'll get to it in a few weeks when we read Bereshit. He makes clothes. God sews. Some people would say, how feminine that God is sewing. And yet it was an act of kindness for Adam and Chava that they shouldn't be walking around, all natural, but instead should have something to wear. And so God makes the clothes. What is God's act of kindness to us in the wilderness? He feeds us. He prepares the meal. He prepares the manna for us. Is that feminine? Because in the 21st century, there's some stereotype that women spend more time in the kitchen than men. On the other hand, God is described as being a lawgiver, as the one who metes out justice. Was that meant to be taken as a masculine depiction of God? Because in our own 21st century, we are still inheriting the baggage of a European ideal where women were not allowed to participate in any of the formal decision-making process, even if they were officially queens? Or do we begin to actually recognize that we need to let go of our baggage if we are going to reclaim the underlying concept of Adonai, the underlying concept of God? That God is not there to conform to our own desire to have a masculine or feminine stereotype. That God is not there to fit neatly into a box that allows us to argue our side of some particular social debate. But that God is God. And God is singular, God is unique, God has no body, God has no gender. And God never intended to imply any of those things through any of God's actions. Instead, we are told that we are to imitate God, that we are to follow in God's path. Does that mean to be masculine like God, to be feminine like God? No. Like we discussed last week when discussing the names of God, it means to follow the actions of God, the titles of God. God clothed the naked, we should clothe the naked. If that means sewing clothes for those that are in need, if it means knitting caps for babies that are in ICU, if that means that you are making donations so that others can provide clothing more directly to those in need, then you do that, and you are being godly in the act. When God fed the hungry, we should learn that we should feed the hungry. Maybe that means standing in front of a stove. Maybe that means donating food, especially in our little pantry outside. Maybe that means donating cash that someone else will turn into food at the end in order to feed that person that is hungry. When God defends the weak, when God pursues justice, when God fights so that the righteous can live, does that mean that we should feel in any of those actions a masculine or feminine element? No. Instead, we should hear a call that goes out to each and every one of us. And each and every one of us, physically, psychologically, constitutionally, will have different ways that we can fulfill the call to imitate God. We are not all gifted at a sewing machine. We are not all gifted at the stove. We are not all gifted with the financial resources to donate money after money after money to help many of these causes. But each of us do have the capacity to still walk in the path of God. And when you look down at those footprints to follow in, they are not boots or high heels. So remember, God doesn't have a body, but it is a path. It is a derech. And walking it is what we call halakha. And that is what God calls us to follow. So we can have a debate about whether there is a preponderance of masculine or feminine. We can have a wonderful linguistic and sociological argument about which parts of human history best exemplify a masculine or feminine ideal based upon the words of Torah. And it's wonderful and academic, and I did all that kind of stuff for many, many years because I was a masochist. But in the end of the day, the true question is, how will you walk in this world? And God did not give you a male soul or a female soul. God gave all of us a soul and called out to your soul, Acharai, follow me. Shabbat Shalom. Conveniently, the first person form in Hebrew does not have a particular gender inflection. So Acharai, after me, doesn't change whether it is a male or female voice calling out.